Microplastics. Well, we can see some white stuff there. It's snowing here today, and there are many factors that affect your health. And one of the emerging issues is that all this plastic around us. So the teams put together a wonderful presentation. Let's learn about microplastics. Tell us more.
Of course. Well, we wanted to start off with a quiz for Dr. Curnew and the team, some true and false, and some of the key takeaways of microplastics. First one, we have your water bottle at the top left. Water bottles are the largest source of microplastics. True or false, Dr. Curnew?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I was reading the medical post the other day, and I didn't realize that bottled water, because of change in temperature, is probably the number one source of microplastics for most of us. So you can see that top picture there is that I have this aluminum water bottle. At one time, I was drinking a lot of bottled water. I stopped in part because of the environment, but I also realized it's a big source of microplastics. We're going to learn about that. Remember, Dr. Ganguly was talking about that too as well. He mentioned cans and things, and team will tell us about that. So I think the answer is true for that one. Long answer. Uh,
Yep,
True.
exactly. That is true. Next one, and this one's a little bit of a scary one. Microplastics have been found in arterial plaques, thrombi, blood clots, lungs, tumors, placenta, liver, all sorts of organs, the brain, and the blood, which was quite a surprise to me. Is this true or false? What do you think?
Yeah, so I've seen some pictures of inflammatory cells, but I also see plastic in many of our organ systems. So from your brain to your lungs to your heart. So this may be an important source of
Yeah,
inflammation and causing problems. Also,
exactly. Yeah. And actually, these are from autopsy studies, the one from the brain or the blood. Um, um, and next one, you can reduce your exposure by the following: not microwaving plastics, switching to non-plastic bottles, switching to cotton shirts, and limiting canned foods.
yeah, what I was being guilty of, I go to Tim Hortons and I take those cups, they say don't put in the microwave. I used to put them in the microwave, and that was a clear source of adding microplastics to the environment. So all these things are really important. So think about not using plastic bottles for water anymore, for the environment and for your health. And the teams are going to tell us about that you want to all the synthetic fibers and stuff are problematic. And remember, Dr. Ganguly told me many years ago. Dr. Ganguly is a physician, very much plant oriented, and he put us to the thing that many cans are lined with plastic. So I think that's all true.
Exactly. All right. Lots of truth here. One last one. We currently don't know at what dose microplastics can harm human health. And to clarify, at what levels, right? So, what levels of exposure? Do we know that or not? True or false?
Yeah, I think this is relatively new science, so I certainly don't know the answer. So I think that's probably a true statement, but I think it's not going to be a good thing. So what I'm going to go to that answer above and say is I'm going to really be attentive to plastic bottles, canned foods, and microwaving, and so what I do right now is I have my ceramic cups. I put my coffee from my Tim Hortons and I microwave that one instead of putting my Tim Hortons cup or my McDonald's cup into the microwave. And what I also try to do is that when I go to many places, I bring my own reusable container mostly for the environment, but it's also just putting hot coffee into a paper cup, which is lined with plastic, is a bad thing. So these are all steps you can do that can improve your health and improve the planet. So, but the team's going to tell us a lot more about this. Tell us more. Is that the right? So the answer is
Yep,
I don't
yep,
know, but
yep. That
it's
is correct.
about it. Less is
Absolutely.
always better.
Yeah, yeah. Because you asked me about, and we'll talk about it in a minute, but about mask and other source of plastic. What is high? We see numbers in billions, and we don't really know what is high. What we do know is that over time it accumulates. This idea of bioaccumulation. Part of it does go through the stool, part of it not, and we can see that from the autopsy studies, it ends up in different places. But we'll tell you more about this. This microwaving option is really important, as you said. This study looked at, it was in the U.S. that 3 minutes of heating it, you release 2.2 billion nanoplastics. A billion is a big number, but so microwave is a no-no. Now it's one of those easy ones, right? It's a low-hanging fruit. That's why I wanted to put it right in the beginning, that if you can microwave things in different containers, please do so. All right, now what are they? Let's talk about that. I'll pass it off to the team.
Yep. So, what are microplastics and nanoplastics? So, there are synthetic particles with regular or irregular shapes. The size of microplastics can range from 1 micrometer to 5 millimeters, whereas the size of nanoplastics are less than 1,000 nanometers. And another important thing to note is that all nanoplastics are considered microplastics. Next one. All right, so now to talk about the human consumption of microplastics, we can start off with a recent study, which shows that researchers stated that people consume an average of 39,000 to 52,000 microplastic particles per year. These results are based on the amounts of microplastics that different foods contain. We can also inhale microplastics, which raises the number to 74,000 particles. Another 4,000 particles are consumed by drinking tap water, and another 9,000 particles from bottled water. Now, despite these concerning numbers, researchers still believe that this data underestimates the actual consumption of microplastics, and the numbers may be even higher. The maximum adult exposure from commonly consumed proteins, such as seafood or meats, or even plant based proteins, is approximately 3.8 million microplastics per year in the US. So that's just a side note. So here, this graph is just highlighting the significant increase in the plastic production in our environment from the 1950s. So as you can see, there's been a substantial increase over the years.
Perfect. And now we're just going to take a second to differentiate between primary and secondary microplastics. So primary microplastics are what we typically think about when we're talking about plastics, right? Those are plastics that are directly released into the environment, and we'll come up with we'll show you guys a few examples in just a second. And these tend to be a bit on the larger end. So typically smaller than 5 millimeters in size. So usually in that microplastic range, right? And then the secondary microplastics are ones that are produced from the destruction of these larger primary microplastics. Those are, again, tend to be about less than 1,000 nanometers in size. So that's more entering that nanoplastic range from the degradation of the primary microplastics. Now, moving on to some examples of primary microplastics. Some of the four main sources of primary microplastics are including car tires, paint-based markings, plastic resins, and synthetic fibers, which are often found in synthetic clothing. Other sources, as you can see here, would include personal care products, cans, which we're going to be discussing in just a second, surgical masks, etc. Perfect. Now, we're talking a little bit more about the evidence around these primary microplastics and how much is actually found. We know that during driving, as well as braking, accelerating when you're moving your car, that can cause wear and tear on those tires, right? And that can lead to the release of microplastics on the road. Then these are carried by wastewater or rain, what have you, into the purification systems. That's one source of primary microplastics that we see. Another is microbeads. These microbeads, which you often will find in cosmetic and care products, like facial exfoliators and soap, things of that nature. We can also find evidence of microplastics here, which tend to be pretty small, less than 2 millimeters in size, and they consist of different types of plastics, which we're going to be discussing, like which ones are dangerous versus not. So these ones will contain polyethylene, polypropylene, and or polystyrene beads. Studies have also found that a single use of facial exfoliator, that's really common, right, that we often use, and that can release between around 5,000 to 95,000 polyethylene microspheres into wastewater. And then because they're so small, they're often less than 100 micrometers in size. They can easily pass through wastewater treatment plants and enter aquatic environments where they can also contribute to that bioaccumulation that Rad was mentioning earlier. Also, washing machines, definitely another large contributor of primary microplastics, because we often find that washing that synthetic clothing that we were discussing can release thousands of strands of microplastic fibers. And these can also, just like the beads, they can bypass the wastewater treatment facilities and again, end up in aquatic environments where they can contribute to bioaccumulation. Next slide. Now just talking a little bit more about these sources of microplastics, primary microplastics, so you guys can get a really good picture of what are these common items that we're going to be talking about throughout. Microplastics can also be found, like as you might have guessed, in plastic water bottles, right? And a study analyzing lots of different, 10 different plastic water bottle brands found that microplastics were present in all samples, and they found ranges between around 3 and 1 particles per liter. Microplastics have also been found, and you might not have guessed this, in table salt. So in a study comparing 16 brands of table salt in China, sea salt was found to have the highest amount of microplastics at between 550 to 700 elements per kilogram, while lake salt and rock salt was slightly lower at 43 to 364 elements per kilogram and 204 elements per kilogram, respectively. And so researchers are also looking at the relationship between the geographic distribution of microplastics found in table salt, so whether it varies from region to region, and how it correlates with some of the environments where plastic pollution is more prevalent, which relates to what I was discussing earlier with the microbeads and the washing machine and how that can cause contamination in aquatic environments. Finally, we're talking about honey. Microplastics have been found in honey samples from various regions. In a study of 47 honey samples in Germany, they found presence of between 10 to 336 synthetic fibers per kilogram of honey, and between 2 to 82 microplastic fragments per kilogram was found as well, which could be attributed to, again, the absorption of microplastics that are found in the environment through plant roots from contaminated water and soil, which are then downstream transmitted to bees through nectar and pollen.
Alrighty. Now, idea of mask as a source of microplastics was a question that we all had because of how much we use these things, even in the pandemic and even right now in healthcare settings and other places. N95 and surgical masks. But this study right here on the left was from 2020, a little bit older, but what they found was it both helped to reduce microplastics and it was a source by itself. So helped as in from the air pollution. A little bit inhalation is reduced, but also by itself it was a source of microplastic. Now, whether that's problematic, we don't know. What we know that it was detected after this inhalation study, and there's a study to the right which is more recent, and these are the highlights that said that face masks can release a large number of nanoparticles. Again, nanoparticles are smaller than microparticle and microplastics, but you see both of them being held. Now, whether there's a problem, we don't know. What we do know is these particles are being found in different organs all throughout. It's one of those things where we probably need more research, and you can also see was detected in the nasal mucus of mask wearers, and you can see a diagram at the bottom. What to make of this, I don't know. Is it problematic? I don't know. Just wanted to mention it.
So my take on this is that there's clear data that wearing a surgical mask decreases respiratory illness. Yeah, I think we pointed out in our previous webinar,
Yes.
5,000 patients randomized to wearing a mask or no mask shows about 20% reduction in any respiratory symptom.
Yeah.
And so I think that they're both filters, so they'll prevent from getting in, and how much these particles will get absorbed. I think we still have lots to learn about that area. One thing that what I'm doing is that, as you know, right now, is that a lot of the bottles that we throw away, those plastic bottles end up in the ocean and in different areas. So I'm keeping all my masks right now in a big garbage bag or something, and there's different ways of recycling and learning about that. So I want to be careful about not just throwing away in the regular garbage at this stage. And also too is that I also want to reuse masks as well. So I keep using the mask until it starts to get that gets wet or dirty or that gets too much moisture in that. And but I think on balance they do a lot more good than harm. But we have lots to learn about that. So that's where I think we sit right now. Any thoughts?
One thought actually. So in study on the left, they also looked at the effect of wearing it multiple days and up to 720 hours. Do the math. So multiple days, and also at different ways of disinfecting. And all those factors increase the level of microplastics in the inhalation test. It just shows that you can reduce it by regularly changing it instead of trying to clean it with different disinfectants, dryers, and wearing it for too long. So that could also be if somebody's really worried about it. But as you said, the benefits probably outweigh the risks, and this is true for many other things. There's always a risk to things, and we don't even know if there's a problem long term. There's probably other sources that are more on the top of the list than this one. All right. Next one, this is probably more of an issue because of how present they are in today's society. Go to every grocery stores, we have canned foods, canned beans, all kinds of things. We also have sodas, right? These two studies looked at sodas. I think Wassam, tell us more about this. You put these research together.
Yeah, absolutely. So these studies were basically looking at single use and sort of different forms of water bottles, whether that be glass, PET, so that's the polyethylene single use plastic ones, and basically comparing the microplastics in each, right? So a study by in 2018 by Altman et al. Found that microplastics were present in water from all of the bottle types. They specifically found that single use PET bottles had around 2,649 plastic parts per liter. And surprisingly, and probably wouldn't expect this, but the glass bottles, those water bottles, were actually quite a bit higher at 6,292 parts per liter. But please do notice the large discrepancy with the plus minus, right? The standard error or the deviation. And when we talk about glass bottles, we're not referring to those reusable ones that you're going to be using over and over and over again, but we're using to more so the soda ones. You won't find like water bottles in Canada as much. It'll be more so like soda bottles that are glass. But that is something that I think is important to keep in mind, right? And this was later corroborated by a 2024 study by Wang et al., where they found that glass bottles had the highest microplastic concentrations, averaging around 228 microplastics per 100 milliliters, which would be closer to like 2,300 per liter. And the author's hypothesis for this was that glass bottles can undergo frequent recycling, which can introduce microplastics through wear and tear over time. Other things that we found in the research was perhaps that the plastic cap in a lot of these bottles might be contributing. There might also be sort of the plastic lining of some of these bottles might also be a factor, but definitely surprising that there is quite a bit of microplastics that are leaking or coming about from the use of these glass bottles.
I guess water should be your number one source from the tap. Does filtering from your tap and stuff like that that you get like from city water or
Yes,
places like or
good question. I actually looked into the different levels. So from water, but for comparison, it is a source. Tap water is also a source of microplastics. But for water bottles was the biggest source. Per liter was 55 billion microplastics. In tap water, per liter was a few thousand. So you can see a difference. Again, we don't know at what dose is a problem because tap water is an everyday source of water, whereas small water bottles are single use. But you can see that relative difference. It is a source, and filtration can help to a certain extent. We don't have slides for that, but from our research, we came across that if you have filtration at home, it can reduce that by a little bit.
It's also interesting too that just the cans, like the canned beans and stuff like that, they're lined with some sort of plastic device. And I know there's some cans that don't have that lining. I don't know too much which ones are or not. Did you find anything about that at all,
That's a
or just
wonderful question. Yeah, I'm not sure if there is research on which brands, but because most of the cans, they can have either BPA, which has its own health problems, or derivatives of BPA or similar analogs to BPA, which is a plastic type that you don't want to have in your system. Um, I wonder if we can, the brand they use on a regular basis, if you look it up to see if that manufacturer uses a certain type of plastic, that could be also a thing. But also, if it's a can that somebody cannot replace with something else, you can definitely contact manufacturers and ask. I'm not sure if they would disclose this, but if somebody is interested, you can probably find answers to these things, to see what it's made of, the inner lining.
thanks so much. And of
Yeah.
course, recycling is important, and you're going to tell us about waste management. Yeah, what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were just talking about, and I went kind of extensively into a lot of the types of primary microplastics, right? But there's also secondary microplastics, which are often produced through degradation over time, and especially when the plastics have been inadequately processed during waste management. So we see that 370 million tons of plastics are produced globally each year, and only 9% of that is recycled. So that really highlights what Dr. Curnew was talking about, which is the importance of recycling these plastics. So 12% is, further 12% are incinerated, and the rest of that, so nearly 80%, is disposed in the environment or ends up in landfills. And this waste becomes a major source of secondary microplastics through degradation, UV rays, what have you. Now, as these plastic polymers degrade, their physical properties and their molecular structure begin to change, and they have a weaker structural integrity and undergo fragmentation into those smaller plastics. So really getting more to that nanoplastic range, right? Below 1,000 nanometers. Okay, perfect. Now we've kind of established what are the different types of plastics, where do we often see them, what are the most common kinds. Kind of wanted to talk about the exposure routes. So this really is tying it back to that human health aspect. So how does it enter our body, and how can it affect us? The three major routes, that's inhalation, ingestion, and dermal contact, which we're going to be getting into now.
So you can see inhalation is actually kind of an important issue too as well. Like we, yeah, I don't know if the different filtering systems that people have and things of that nature are good enough. I don't think they're good enough to get these particles, are they? Do HEPA filters help these sorts of things? I know like wearing a mask, a surgical mask will help viruses and bacteria, but how much? And you mentioned that they do actually stop some of the microplastics from getting in there, but um, can people actually filter? Do home filters and stuff like that work at all? Do
Yeah,
HEPA
yeah.
filters work on all that at all?
I actually, it's funny you say this because we have HEPA filters in our clinic. I did look this up. You can. It is a source, but to what degree, I don't know. But from our research, you can reduce it. What is a concern is for people who work in workplaces where they're exposed, and in cities where air pollution is a huge concern, not just for the microplastics in it, but for other reasons as well. In fact, something we haven't mentioned is the link between um, microplastics and neurodegenerative diseases. We know air pollution is one of the risk factors determined for dementia, and microplastics seems to be in that causal link as one of the reasons why it increases the risk. Again, it's this more long term in cities where air pollution is more of a concern. In more local settings, it would be occupational hazards. I don't think that would apply to our clinic or schools, but HEPA filters can reduce these to a certain degree. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting all the water balls that people use because you store them if you put them in the trunk of your car, you get heat and that increases
Of
the
course.
release. And so one of the biggest problems with so what you just taught me for all sorts of reasons is that I'm never gonna or I'm gonna try to avoid bottled water and water in uh, in those plastic containers there because A, it's bad for the environment. You're saying that over 90% of it just get back into the environment in some way, and the temperature change, and it's probably for most of us the number one source of microplastics. So get your reusable aluminum um, um, water bottles or coffee mugs. Um, you know, don't microwave plastic and things, and these are things that you really bring up is really really important, and um, it's pretty spooky. Tell us more.
Yeah, so speaking of inhalation, first of all, on average, it is how much would you think is estimated that a person, how much microplastics do we inhale daily?
This is going to be a pure guess. I'm going to put 130. I don't know why C.
Okay, the next slide.
That's just a pure guess.
Well, you're correct. It is 130.
One in
So
doubt.
yeah, so humans can breathe in airborne microplastics, primarily polyester, which is making up about 4% of all inhaled organic particles. Now, the primary production of airborne MPs include the breakdown of larger plastics from UV light, whereas the secondary production of airborne MPs can occur through things like clothing. Airborne MNPs, the micro nanoplastics, can include construction materials, landfills, and plastic abrasions. And now it should be noted that exposure can be significantly impacted by one's occupation. So individuals working in factories that use a large amount of plastics are at risk of inhaling these fibers. Inhalation of flock, which are zero point 0.2 to zero point 0.5 millimeters polymer threads used in fur-like fabrics, they've been linked to respiratory issues such as dyspnea, difficulty breathing. Now, although the general population's exposure to inhaled microplastics is less significant compared to occupational exposure, and this area is still new and the research is still ongoing. Next slide. Now, in terms of ingestion, we can ingest microplastics directly and indirectly. Direct ingestion occurs when consuming food or water contaminated with microplastics due to the way they're processed, packaged, or direct contamination by the primary or secondary microplastics. And indirect ingestion is also known as trophic transfer, which involves consuming organisms that have ingested microplastics. This has been documented in things like algae, fish, and more species, with a study finding that 36.5% of fish in the English Channel were found to have MP contamination, regardless of their feeding location or species. And now regarding the ingested MPs, the European Food Safety Authority suggests that over 90% of it is excreted through urine and feces, but this area is still being explored. Next slide. Now, the final route of exposure is dermal contact. Research indicates that microplastics can be absorbed through the skin, which is a process known as subcutaneous absorption, and it is heavily influenced by size. On the left here, we have a study by Bose et al., which proposes the 500 DA rule, and it examines the molecular weights of tropical drugs and common contact allergens. And it shows that when a molecule's weight exceeds 500 daltons, its absorption through the human skin decreases significantly. On the right, we have a study by Filon et al., which suggests that particles up to 4 nanometers can cross intact in skin, while particles ranging from 4 to 20 nanometers can penetrate both damaged and intact skin. And as you can see, the particles between 21 to 45 nanometers can cross only through the damaged skin. Furthermore, a recent study in spring 2024 by the University of Birmingham proposed that toxic materials from chemicals, such as flame retardants, can be absorbed into the body through skin contact. Thank you. Next slide.
Perfect. Awesome. So now that we've sort of established some of the major routes through which exposure can occur to micro and nanoparticles, we wanted to kind of guide you guys through the process of what kind of risks this pose, what is the current evidence surrounding these micro and nanoplastics, and the potential adverse effects, cardiac related, and even like related to other things like guts or some of the other things that some of my colleagues were talking about. So here, and just as Manal mentioned, a lot of this research is still ongoing. It's still it's rife with a lot of research, right? But one 2024 review conducted by Winiarska et al. Provided a comprehensive review of the current literature regarding the impact of these micro and nanoplastics on human health. So here they kind of, in the graphical abstract, they showed the entire process of nano and microplastic exposure, from the actual plastics to the degradation to these routes of exposure, again, inhalation, skin digestion that we talked about, and a lot of these health risks as well. And these health risks, I mean, it includes several different issues, such as respiratory disorders that include lung cancer, asthma, hypersensitivity, pneumonitis, as well as neurological symptoms that include fatigue, dizziness, inflammatory bowel disease, and even disturbances in like the gut microbiota, which can lead to gut dysbiosis, which can lead to several mental health issues and other issues of that kind. But they did, and they were very cautious to conclude that existence literature cannot conclusively determine the actual risks of plastics on human health, so whether they're, the extent of the risks that they actually pose to human health, and that's something that we need to research a lot further. Perfect. And just wanted to highlight another study as well. And this is also quite recent, again, published in March of 2024 by Marfala et al. And what they did was they actually analyzed the carotid plaque specimens in 18 to 75-year-old patients that were undergoing surgery to look for the presence of micro and nanoparticles in these samples. Then, based on whether these samples actually had these plastics, they split those patients into two groups, right? Those who had the plastics and those who didn't. And then they followed them. So this was a prospective study. So they followed them over time. They found that of the patients who had these micro and nanoplastics, the proportion that developed a composite of either non-fatal myocardial infarctions, heart attack, non-fatal stroke, or all-cause death, meaning death for any reason, the proportion of those was over 4.5 times higher than in those who did not exhibit or did not show evidence of plastics in their plaque specimens. And so again, we don't definitively know what the exact causes are or what's going on specifically, but I mean, this is something that we need to research and something that's worth researching.
Well, this just tells us that plaques. This is a huge increase. Now this is it's this is based on observational data. So observational data has its limitations, but 4.5 times higher is really really high. So tells me that you find these in plaques, and you find them in brain tissues, other organ systems. Is that um, and and if you look at atherosclerotic plaque, there's lots of inflammation cells, all these white cells from uh, neutrophils to lymphocytes to these are your body's trying to fight inflammation. So these are irritants to the vessels and or organ systems. So something to keep in mind. So I'm going to try to spend more time. And I remember when I read that article in the Medical Post about bottled water, that made a big impact onto me, and also stopped me from microwaving um, plastic. And there's different levels of plastic that they say they're microwave safe and different things of that nature as well. But I'm going to limit microwaving to try to avoid plastic in the microwave and just in cooking in general. But
Since you mentioned
yeah,
cooking, I just wanted to put a side note. We have not mentioned cookware. We're going to have a webinar on which ones are good and which ones are not good, but non-stick pans are also a source. To what degree,
yeah,
I do not know, but they are a source as well. Just wanted to mention.
yeah. I heard some really important things about that. They're a bigger source than we think. So like
Yes,
and
because of the
so
heat as well and the
yeah, yeah,
frequency of the use. Yeah.
yeah. So we have to rethink our the way we cook too as well. And
Air
um,
fry and air fry when in doubt. I think that's something I do.
and, it's interesting that people say they're going to bake and not use a microwave. Looks like microwave, if you don't use plastic, is not a bad way of cooking, at least for microplastics. And
Right. What are the other effects? We just mentioned heart health. You mentioned the brain. There was an autopsy. We don't have it on the slide, but they did an autopsy around 90 people, and around 20 of them had microplastics in their brain. But they found microplastics in every organ, but the brain was magnitudes higher. No idea why. But it is also a study here recently from September of this past year showing that in 8 out of 15 autopsies, they found microplastics in the olfactory bulbs, also showing how inhalation could be a source to get up there all the way to the executive centers. They've also seen it in the hippocampus area. Very surprising to me to see this because of the blood-brain barrier and some of the other mechanisms of protection for the brain. How it's end up there, going there is probably being carried by other things. Maybe it's small enough to go through the blood-brain barrier. Maybe that's the reason, but we see it there anyways. And so again, also putting all these together, we know that air pollution was a risk factor for dementia, and also there's other evidence showing that microplastics in air are source of a risk factor for dementia. So putting all these together, the confidence that it's causal is going up, but we'll have to see. Some other
so
things. Yeah, go
a
ahead.
couple things we know about the brain is that the brain takes 25% of your sugar. It's a tremendously vascular organ. It's five. I think it's 5% of your weight, but its blood
Yeah.
supply is huge. We're supposed to have this blood-brain barrier that protects, but obviously, um, I'm not sure. God made us to protecting against microplastics. Big blood supplies go to the brain, good big energy production to go to the brain, so it's getting to the brain. Um, so and uh, what I'll remind you is that dementia starts around the age of 30. Everything starts to fall apart at age of 30, and one of the things that, your LDL cholesterol in your blood, it has a different metabolism in the brain, but having high serum cholesterol is a marker for Alzheimer's disease, for instance. Um, Smoking, exercise, uh, and building more neuron connections and keeping that weight down. Overweight is an inflammatory process. Plastic causes inflammation. So this is just another thing to think about. And here's something I learned just a little while ago is that you can actually grow your brain. And one of the two best ways of growing your brain is?
Exercise and sleep? Probably not.
So actually, sleep is actually really important for
No.
eliminating
Yeah.
um, um, these
Neurotoxins and everything. Yeah.
toxins but basically is that you build new connections by learning new things. And it actually grows your brain. And resistance exercise is actually important for building brain. So, is that sleep actually is really important for cleansing the brain and keeping your cholesterol down, your blood sugar down, your weight down, not smoking, no alcohol. They actually protect your brain, but you actually grow brain by resistance training and by learning new thoughts. And one of the things that I learned is that when you retire, if you had a high functioning job and you go from being very working hard on your brain to not using your brain and watching those 30 hours of TV a week, your brain is it's like a muscle. A muscle wants to be trained. Your brain wants to be trained, and if you lose that, you accelerate dementia. And so these are all things to think about. And let's keep the plastic out of your brain. Let's actually build brain cells or brain connections. Keep learning new thoughts. And these webinars are teaching me new things. So that's going to help put a few more connections. Because I just had my cataract surgery, I can't do any resistance training for 2 weeks. But you're going to laugh at me. Is that yesterday I finished clinic late like normal. I said, did I go to the gym or not? Because I'd be at my cataract surgery for 7 this morning. Is that my gym closed at 11. I got to the gym at 10:33 and exercised to 10:59. So lifted some heavy weights and then I last a little bit for the next couple of weeks. I know we have our Olympics coming up, so I'm going to start in last place, but I'm going to catch up to you guys later on, and
Indeed, you will. Yeah.
and then we'll make some more brain cells or
Of
connections.
course.
And
Speaking of air pollution, they also found a link between that and some of the cancer, so lung cancer and colon cancer. Again, these are links. You can see that at the bottom left. And the other thing interesting that I wanted to mention was they found that in blood clots and thrombi in people who had stroke. So there's a study, 80% of participants who had undergone thrombectomy procedures because of strokes, MIs. They found microplastics, and the interesting point was that higher concentrations was associated with higher severity, right? So whenever we see that dose response effect, we think it's causal and not just observationally confounded by other variables. But I think we hit the nail home right now. Yeah. Okay. Mechanisms. What are the mechanisms?
So the mechanism of inflammation is important, but one thing to remember is that the good thing is that preventing cancer, preventing neurodegenerative disease, Alzheimer's disease, preventing heart disease, they're all the same. All the risk factors,
Yes.
you get bang for your buck by just doing all the right things.
Yes.
So let's look at some mechanisms of the inflammation. It's interesting that the trials that use, medications for anti-inflammation um, work a little bit, but they're not great so far. But to me is that is preventing the inflammation, as you're talking about, is probably even more important. So one of the things is that plastic is going to be something I'm going to be thinking about as my repertoire of exercise, weight reduction, cholesterol, blood pressure. Um, uh, less stress management, better sleep, all these sorts of things are just all adding up to a better quality and quantity of life. But let's look at some mechanisms here. This is interesting because we know that cholesterol, for instance, causes inflammation. We know that smoking causes inflammation. Um, and let's find out. Looks like microplastics do the same thing. Tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a preface before really diving into these mechanisms, I do want to mention that the real key takeaways that we're hoping that anyone who's watching this will get out of the webinar is just those epidemiological studies that we showed and those outcomes that we had. This is more of like curiosity, just in case that you were um, wondering like why how does it cause these like downstream effects, cardiovascular effects. And so, yeah, this is just more for curiosity, but to that end, we know that micro and nanoplastics are involved in several complex mechanisms through which they elicit their effects or their damage on the body. So we're just going to quickly outline how the plastics affect these mechanisms and the resultant adverse health effects that we were talking about, again, with an emphasis, sorry, on the cardiovascular system. So key amongst these mechanisms is oxidative stress. We know that micro and nanoplastics produce reactive oxygen species, or ROS, which contribute to the development of cardiovascular disease through, as you can see here, cellular injury, as well as inflammation. For instance, one study found that after exposing primary cardiomyocytes, so cardiac cells, and chicken hearts to microplastics, they found elevated levels of reactive oxygen species, which resulted in, again, downstream oxidative stress, myocardial hypothermia, inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, and energy metabolism disorders. This was also later confirmed when Lee et al. Used a rat model with microplastic exposure, which resulted in structural damage and apoptosis, or cell death, in the myocardial cells. Nice. So now moving on to the cardiac fibrosis, we know that, oh, sorry, yeah. Cardiac fibrosis, we know that repeated exposure to microplastics and nanoplastics can provoke this fibrosis, which is essentially where the cardiac muscle becomes scarred, and that's due to the deposition or the placement of extracellular matrix proteins. While this deposition of these proteins is usually protective, right, because it assists with the wound healing and regeneration of tissue, clots in excess deposition can impair tissue function. So that's something that can happen as well. And I kind of outlined the mechanism through which this can happen. So we start with cardiomyocytes, so these cardiac cells, their apoptosis, which we mentioned, which can happen through these reactive oxygen species, would stimulate the activation of fibroblasts to myofibroblasts, which you can see here. The myofibroblasts then multiply, and then they cause the deposition of this excess protein. And then that excess protein and the change in the matrix composition can lead to stiffness, and this stiffness can lead to fibrosis, and this can cause problems with cardiac function, including, in the worst case scenario, it could even lead to the pathogenesis of heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, which is seen in a lot of patients. So just moving on, another mechanism through which I can elicit its damage is through microvascular toxicity. So these plastics can create a toxic environment for the microvasculature, so these small veins and arteries, and that can contribute downstream to lots of bad things that we don't want, including the dysfunction of endothelial cells, thrombosis, which is kind of formation of clots, hemolysis, which can cause damage to blood, as well as vascular aging. And finally, another thing to mention is there are tons of non-cardiovascular effects as well. So, for example, plastics can adversely affect non-cardiovascular systems. So Xie all found that exposing male mice to microplastics actually led to a decrease in sperm count, as well as molecular markers of reproductive health. Now, not to get too stressed out, I mean, this hasn't been repeated in humans, but it is something to be aware of. Similarly, Anne et al. Found that plastic particles accumulated in the ovaries of female rats, and as well the ovaries that were exposed to nanoplastics had increased markers of oxidative stress, along with higher rates of apoptosis. Again, we still need ongoing research to confirm this and also see if the effects translate over to human models. Awesome. So, I mean, what's our real like takeaway message from this? What can we do on a daily basis to limit our microplastic exposure? Because realistically, it's not like we don't breathe. I mean, we're going to have to eat. A lot of these things are necessities in the modern world, right? So we kind of used the case of Jane to sort of illustrate some of the measures we might take. So she's 65, no allergies, and she's living right here in Hamilton, Ontario. Some of her habits, just like us, shopping, skincare, dining, and some of her risk factors include age, heart disease, diabetes, and hypertension. So what would our suggestions or our really take-home messages be for her? Well, first is to utilize reusable alternatives. Obviously, we saw in previously this glass and plastic bottles can often have these microplastics, right? And so using non-plastic water bottles such as stainless steel, glass, copper, titanium bottles, or some of those small, I know like one of those bigger like mugs are pretty popular these days as well. So just using those would be good, as well as choosing clothing made from natural fabrics such as cotton, wool, and linen, as well as avoiding a lot of those products that have microbeads, limiting some of the cosmetics and skincare products, or seeing kind of how they're made, right? Being more aware of our role as consumers. So yeah, skincare products and lotions that might also have microplastics. Also, something that we were discussing as we putting this presentation is a lot of these cosmetic products will be leaving on like throughout the day, right? The entire day. And so we don't really think about it or don't really pay attention to it. So for example, if you're applying makeup or something like that, just make sure to properly clean your face out at the end of the day. And again, really important, do not microwave plastic foods, and as much as possible, limit canned foods, not just because of the microplastics, like obviously that's one reason, but they also have very high levels of sodium and other things that aren't the best for your health.
All great suggestions there, and recycle as well, right?
Yep, of course. Also, this slide very important. We wanted to mention some of the different types. There's 7 different types of plastic. 3, 6, and 7 are bad and shown in red, right? So you can see PVC is 3. I don't think anybody's going to be directly exposed to that, but it's from tap water. That's one of the sources. 6, you have the styrofoam containers limiting that, and 7 would be all the other types, so-called BPA that people might have heard of, PFAS, phthalates, and these are the ones that are linked with historically right now with the worst outcomes, health outcomes that we know should be limited, right? So canned foods have BPA in them. I thought BPAs were banned in Canada. Just did some research. Apparently they are not, and there's still some products indirectly. So trying to limit that is an option. Again, canned foods are bad for different reasons. Sodium is one, and also the other reasons, but plastic is another one. And you can see some of the green ones. It says okay to use, and the reason behind these labels is because of its degradation time, right? So the green ones take longer to degrade in food. And number 1 is the PET bottles. You can see they're meant for single use, not repeated use. So we mentioned that as well. Alrighty. Last thing, Olympic. We have Olympic going on, Curly Olympics. Anybody who's interested, we have about 8 people participating. Mine is Dr. Curnew and myself and some of the other volunteers. You participate in health challenges. Last week was liquid calories awareness week, and next week is going to be something else. We have challenges coming up. You get points. We have prizes at the end. We had a webinar on this a week ago. You can take a look. If anybody who's listening, you don't have to be a patient of ours to participate. The link to participate is in the description of this video. You can join us. There's going to be some prizes at the end. We don't know what they're going to be. A bunch of different things. We're going to make them exciting. Please join us if you're on the verge of doing something healthy, but you want a little bit of a push, a little bit of motivation. Here's your motivation. Some group work, some accountability to be a part of a team. We're going to have leaderboards with our push-up month coming up. Probably should have put our push-up month, but anyone who wants to join, the app is called Push for Better. It's for mental health awareness, and our team's name is Curnew Athletes. We're going to have a video on that very soon, but stay tuned for that as well.
So just backtrack to that what we should back one more there.
Yep.
But I think this is actually a good take-home message. So we're finding that microplastics are everywhere. What I don't know is how much of we're in ingestion versus inhalation versus contact of the skin. Does anybody have a sense of where most of it, where it comes from? I know the number one source that I read in one article I read was just water bottles. So that's an easy one to get rid of. And when you hear that we're not doing a good job in recycling, I don't want to put more in the environment. So I'm going to try to I use more and more, and my lovely wife made me some kombucha, and we got in a glass bottle over here. So I'm going to treat my microbiome, and those are good things. And I think all the things that you see here are really, really important. So I've changed my practice. Good reinforcements. I need to do better. And any final thoughts from anyone?
Well, one final thought is you mentioned which one is the more prominent one, which route of ingestion, inhalation, or dermal contact. From what I've gathered, it seems to be in most people, pollution is the biggest one because everybody breathes, and also it's easier access to the brain, at least from the totality of the science that we have right now. Second is ingestion because of the evidence in different organs and finding it in a sample 80% of people in their blood. And the last one would be dermal contact for various reasons. And somebody was mentioning you exercise, you sweat, making sure that you have the right clothing on, that's plastic free. But again, in priority is inhalation, ingestion, and dermal contact. Not exactly, but from what I've gathered, that seems to be the order. But again, these are the key takeaways. Try to do what you can do, right?
And I never really thought about the clothes you wear using a natural wool and cotton versus synthetic clothes that are
Yeah,
important.
especially when you exercise. And I'm guilty of this, right? I have plenty of such these plastic made shirts, and I use it during exercise. I don't think about it, but maybe something to change, yeah.
Well, listen, I want to thank everybody for a wonderful presentation. Learned a lot, and one more thing to think about. And so thank you so much. Good night, everyone, and we'll see you on the Olympic Challenge.